Welcome to another video that's offered through Maranatha Baptist University and Maranatha Baptist Seminary, where we're doing some translation out of the book of Ephesians. We're going from Greek to English. In this video, we're going to be looking at chapter 4, verses 1 through 16. And as we begin, I just wanted to share a couple of resources that recently have been a blessing to me that have to do with what this text is talking about. The first one is the story of B. Myron and Thelma M. Cedarholm, Called to the Praise of His Glory, written by Dr. Larry Oates, who is from, of course, Maranatha Baptist University and Seminary. He's one of my teachers. And I was really helped by this book, blessed to learn the history of Maranatha, but also some of what's fleshed out in Dr. Cedarholm's life has to do with what Dr. Oates writes about in the Church of the Fundamentalists. And the subtitle kind of gives away the idea. It says, An Examination of Ecclesiastical Separation in the 20th Century. One of the things that divides some denominations is what they believe determines what's necessary for separation, or if separation, ecclesiastical separation, is even necessary. And I want to read the first few verses, or translate the first few verses from Ephesians. We're going to look at them in more depth, but let me just translate them real quick for us. Chapter 4 says, I exhort, therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord, that you walk worthy of the calling with which you were called, with all meekness and humility, with all long-suffering or patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And there's that word, unity. And the question is, what should unite groups? What should divide groups? And then he goes on to talk about the fact that there is one body and one Spirit, even as you are called in one hope of your calling. Of course, different groups to determine what it means, for instance, to be filled with the Holy Spirit. Is there maybe a second blessing we should expect in the Christian life? And people could debate about that. But as there's going to be a list of things that should unite us in our doctrine. This is a great passage to use for determining what does doctrinal purity look like. It has to do with right doctrine about the body or the church, about the Spirit, about the hope of our calling. For instance, isn't it true that some people think that the kingdom is already here, that Christ came in the person of His Spirit? But this is not the blessed hope as it's presented in the New Testament. And so these are things that we have to have correct if they're going to unite us. He says there's just one hope of your calling. There's one Lord, one faith, one baptism. And we could park on that term for a minute too, one baptism. There's so many different interpretations of baptism, but what is the New Testament interpretation of baptism? Anyway, this is a wonderful passage, and it's a little bit longer. There's 16 verses here. So as always, I hope you'll take each section into account, compare your translation with what my translation is, and let's grow in our knowledge of and appreciation for Greek, especially as we start out thinking about what are the things that should unite us. So let's translate Ephesians 4 verses 1 through 16. Here we have the text in a smaller version or a condensed form, so we can kind of get an idea of what we're dealing with. This text is a little bit longer than the majority of the paragraphs that we're translating in this series of translations. But we're going to begin right here in Ephesians 4:1. It begins with parakalo, which is I exhort or I encourage. And so let's go with I exhort. And then we've got which is therefore. So let's plug that in. Therefore, I exhort you. Humas is you, so therefore I exhort you. And the I here is repeated because he's going to emphasize the fact that he is the prisoner in the Lord, or we might say in English, of the Lord. And sometimes in the Pauline letters, he makes clear that he is a prisoner of the Lord. He was a slave to sin before, and now he's a slave to righteousness, which is the best way to be in this life. But here, since he's actually writing from prison, he probably has in view the fact that he's literally a prisoner for the Lord. If he's a prisoner of the Lord, that means that might have a reference to the fact that he's a slave for righteousness, but here probably in view is the fact that he's a prisoner for the Lord. Therefore, I exhort you. So let's put that in English a little bit closer to the pronoun. Therefore, I, the prisoner for the Lord, exhort you. And then he says axios, worthy, peripatese, to walk, from peripateo. So it's walk worthy. And then he's going to say of the calling. Case, relative pronoun, by which or for which you were called. So let's come back up here and figure out the best way to state that. Therefore I, the prisoner for the Lord, exhort you to walk worthy, and then we're back over here with tes, of the calling by which you were called. And then we're in verse 2 with meta, with the genitive. So with, every, or all, and then he uses one of his favorite terms that refers to humility. So we've got with all humility. With all humility. Someone might say, well, isn't this singular? It is singular. Maybe with every humble action, but everything needs to be done with humility. With all humility kind of captures that idea. With all humility, and praotetos is meekness. With all humility and meekness, and then he says meta macrothumias here. This is the word for patience or long-suffering. With patience, or we might say long-suffering. Sometimes what happens is he'll use a couple of terms that are synonymous, and if he does have patience and long-suffering, we might say long-suffering for this one, and then if there's a synonym, we might choose the term patience. But we can always come back and smooth that out. And then he has down here, anekamenoi alelon in agape. Anekamenoi is the word for bearing with, being kind of patiently putting up with others. Alelon is one another, and then this is how it's to be done, in love. With patience, or with long-suffering, we could say bearing with one another in love. Spudadzontes is the word for making every effort. Teren is from tereo, guard. And then enoteta is the word for unity. So let's go ahead and translate this out. Spudadzontas, making every effort to keep the enoteta, unity of the Spirit. En to sundesmo. Sundesmo is not a word we see too often in the New Testament. Translated in the King James is bond, and the idea is something that knits two things together. Bond is a good term, and the bond of peace. Unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And then we get to verse 4, hen, when it has the rough breather. We know it's not the preposition, but it's the noun which means, or the adjective which means one. And then soma, we've got body, and then we've got one spirit as well. And so let's go ahead and translate that out. He says one body and hen pneuma, and one spirit. Okay, now we've got a phrase, but the question is, where's the verb? And the answer is the verb is understood here. One body and one spirit. Well, in English we might say something like, there is one body and one spirit. Kathos is even as. Kai is probably also here. Eklethete from kaleo, we see that it's got the theta eta. That's the aorist passive tense formative, second person plural, of course, because he's talking to the Ephesians. So you were called in, and then when we go back to the way we memorized this noun, hais miachen, when one is modifying a feminine noun or pronoun, it's going to be written as mia in the feminine form. Looks quite a bit different from hen, but it does mean one. And so it's one hope. So even as you were called, even as also, don't want to forget the kai there, you were called in one hope of tes something. Let's move down a little bit here. You were called in one hope of, kleseos is calling, and then humon, the calling of you. Okay, that's in one hope of your calling. He's talking about things that unify these believers. And so when we talk about, we want to have fellowship with others, we also need to have that fellowship be hinged upon good doctrine, because if you lose good doctrine, you're going to lose the foundation for good fellowship. And this would be a great passage to study out, to say, are these things that we have in common with people that we're considering fellowshipping with or working with on an ecclesiastical level? He's talking about these are the essential things that unite us. And he's going to go on here and say that there is Chais Kurios, one Lord. And so we might include once again, there is, because it's understood, there is one Lord, and then Mia, one Lord. And again, we'd have to decide how often we want to include there is. We want it to be clear stylistically. Ideally, it will also look nice or sound nice. But for right now, I'll just include it right here. There is one Lord. And then we have Mia Pistis, one faith. And then we have Hen Baptisma, one baptism. Verse 6, he says, we might include one more time here, there is Chais Theos, there is, so one God, and Father. Panton is from pas, right? And we see the on, so it's genitive plural. One God and Father of all. And here we have two nouns, anarthrous without the article, connected by kai. He's saying that God is the Father of all. There is one God and Father of all. Ha, referring back to God, functioning as a relative pronoun. Who, I think the being verb is going to be understood here. Who is epipanton, who is over all. Kai, and dia is through with the genitive, who is over all and through all, and en pasin, okay, and in all. Now the question is, what does he mean in all? Like in all of you? And we might put that in question mark. We can always come back. This is part of the task of doing word studies and doing systematic theology, is figure out what does this mean, because what happens with in the cults is that they will take one word or one phrase and divorce it from its broader context, whether we're talking about paragraph or a book or the canon, for instance, the New Testament, and they'll come up with their own ideas. One thing that certainly is not true about this passage is that God is in everything in some pantheistic sense. God is overall. He's the governor of all things. He'll make sure that history plays out and closes just the way he wants. Through all. Now, and what we're seeing throughout this book is that God works in and through believers, so it's more likely that he has all of the believers in view, and he's in those who are in Christ. And so more than likely here he's talking about the fact that God is over all things, and he's working perhaps through all things, but particularly through believers, and he's in believers as well. But there's nothing that escapes his sovereignty, and that's something that should be very clear as we read the end of verse 6 there. So we're in 4:7. Heni again is the word for one. And then we've got ekasto from ekastos, which is each. This is in the dative. And so to each one of us, edothe from didomi, it's got the theta eta, so it's aorist passive, something is given. So let's go ahead and begin to translate this out. Now, to each one of us, edothe, is given hekaris. One of the most beautiful words in the New Testament would be hekaris, which is the word for grace. Now to each one of us is given grace, katata, according to. Metron is the word for measure. And then tes doreos, of the gift of Christ. According to the measure of the gift of Christ. Okay, and then we get to verse 8 here. Diolege, therefore, or for this reason, he says, it looks like he's getting ready for a biblical quote here. For this reason, he says, okay, now quoting an Old Testament passage. Anabas, okay, that is a aorist participle from anabino, and it says, so we probably want to translate this, when he ascended or after he ascended, on high, eis upsas is the word for the heights or height. So when he ascended on high, and then we have the word, the verb, the aorist third person singular form of the verb that means to lead captive, and this is the word for captivity. So for this reason, he says, when Anabas, it looks like he's talking about just somebody, in this case Christ, when he ascended on high, he led captivity captive. He led captivity captives, and then it says edoken from dinomi, he gave domata gifts to men or people. We'll say men here. When he ascended on high, he led captivity captive. He gave gifts to men. Okay, so this is a quote, so we'd want to come back through our translation, maybe put it in quotations and make that clear. He gave gifts to men. And then we get to verse 9, and when it begins with the article like this, he's setting apart part of the quotation like ta anebe, and then this is going to be a little tricky to get it just right in English. What is it, or what does it mean, this part, the ta anebe? He's talking about the fact that he ascended. What is it? What does it mean? So we got to figure out a way to say that in English. So we might say what does he ascended mean? And then eme is except that also he katebe, that's the opposite of anebe, this is descend, he descended into, and then katotera is the lower region, mere, of the earth. Okay, so now what does he ascended mean? Except that also he descended, and we might even clarify it by saying he first, not technically in the text, that's the idea, except that he also descended, aista, into the katotera, the lower, mere is region, lower region of the earth. And then we've got a question mark. Okay, so what the Apostle Paul is doing, he's taking this Old Testament quote and saying that this applies to Christ. He ascended, that means that he also went down first. And now the question is, what exactly does it mean that Christ descended? Well, we'd want to do a contextual study of that Old Testament passage and see if maybe Paul, I don't think Paul mentions this anywhere else in his writings. But here it's the lower regions of the earth. It seems as though he's talking about Christ descended in the sense that he took upon himself the form of a servant. He was made in the likeness of men, as he says in Philippians. He became a man. He lived on the earth. He came down to the earth, and then he ascended into heaven again. But let's continue in this passage here. Maybe there will be some light shed on it. The one who, because this is a substantive participle, right? This is from katabaino. It's got the article, so the one who descended, then autos being used probably identically here. Remember, autos can be used as a pronoun, it can be used intensively, it can be used identically as in the same. And so let's say the one who descended is the same also. So this way we reflect autos identically. Kai would be the also, is the same also. Who anabas, who ascended, is the same also who ascended. Uparano is the word for far above. All. Ton uranon would be all the heavens, who ascended far above all the heavens. In order that, or that, let's just put in order that, from plerao, of course it's the subjunctive, third person singular, and this would be the aorist, subjunctive, in order that he may or might fill all things. In order that he may fill all things. And again, when we're doing a study of what the tapanta above means when Christ is in all, we might take into account how he uses the tapanta throughout the book, especially in the local passage here as we try to come to some conclusions. In order that he may fill all things. All right? And let's continue with verse 11. Kai, and he, edoken, we've already seen this, didomi, he gave. And now we have the, let me translate this out. And he gave, now this is the article. We should be able to identify that. It's accusative, plural. We know that by looking at the ending. This is the partitive use and the substantive partitive use of the article. The idea is he gave some, or he made some. He gave to some, the idea is the gift of apostle. What's interesting here is that this is the term that just means apostles. And so it's the accusative plural. He gave some apostles. The idea is he gave some the gift of apostleship. But we've got to figure out, we got to be a little dynamic here if we're going to have good English. So we might say something like this. And he gave some the gift of being, I know that's quite a bit, but that's the idea. And he gave some the gift of being an apostle. And to some, and he gave some, and to some that of prophet. Okay, we're being a little dynamic here. As you think about the best way to reflect this in English, you might think of something that's a little bit different here. Not to say that there's more than one meaning in a text, there certainly isn't. But when you're going from one language to another, sometimes there's more than one way to correctly state something. He gave some the gift of being an apostle, and to some that of being, we might say. And we'll put that in parentheses, that of being a prophet. To others, an evangelist, or evangelist, literally. He gave some to be evangelists, to others an evangelist. Still to others, this is the idea here. Put that in parentheses as well. Still to others. Now it's shepherds and teachers. So if we're going to stick with the gift of being, still to others, that of shepherd and teacher. Pros ton katartismon. Okay, so this is for. The katartismon is the perfection or the completion. Ton agion would be of the saints. So let's go ahead and type this in. For the perfection of the saints. It says, eis ergon, for the work of the ministry, for the perfection of the saints, for the work of the ministry. Eis, and the question here we'd want to ask ourselves is eis, what is its connection to pros here? That's something we want to determine as we continue to work through this passage. So the perfection of the saints, for the work of the ministry, and then he continues, for the edification of the body of Christ. For, that's how we're going to translate the pros and the eis throughout this passage, just for the edification of the body of Christ. Mekri is until, and then katantesomen is the idea of having arrived, having achieved, or attained. And so we want to choose the best one based on what follows it. And what he says down here is all of, and now we're talking about us, right? Well, Paul and the readers, but we can include ourselves if we're Christians. In other languages, sometimes you'll see what we use as an adjective, all of us, is its own separate noun, and the person is specified in the verb itself, but we're talking about all of us might attain something. And then he talks about the unity of the faith. So how would we say that? Attain, arrive at, probably attain would be the best translation. So until we all, because we see the hoi pontes down there, right? Until we all attain unto the unity of the faith. Well, let's just say, if we use attain, the unto is kind of understood in the English verb. Until we all attain the unity of the faith. And now it's interesting here, this is the accusative, right? Tain enoteta, until we attain unity. That's modified by faith, the unity of the faith. And then the of the knowledge, so it's the unity of the knowledge of the Son of God. It's modifying, just like tes pisteos is modifying enoteta, right there, so is epignoseos. The unity of the faith, and just in case it's not clear, the unity of the faith and the unity of the knowledge to huiu to theu of the Son of God. And this is the end of it, to a perfect man or a complete man. Unto or towards would be the idea. I would probably put to become, as it's understood, to become a perfect man. Now he's talking about basically this body metaphor that he's going to continue to expand upon. The church is to become like a perfect man as we grow up into all that Christ is. To become a perfect man okay, now we've got metron elikias. This is generally the word for age, but it can be a reference to maturity as well. The measure of the maturity or the measure of the age. We might just translate this as maturity. King James has the measure of the stature. That gives the picture too, that it's a fully developed, fully mature person. We might say to reach the maturity, and then down here we have the fullness of Christ, to reach the maturity of the fullness of Christ. Hina, in order that no longer we might be, nepioi is the word for children. In order that we may no longer be children. We have two verbs here that aren't so common. The first one particularly has the idea of being tossed about by a wave. This one we might be a little more able to recognize. It's the word for being carried about. So we've got being tossed about, being carried about. So let's put it this way. Tossed and carried about. Panti is from paspasapan. It has the iota subscript, so the idea is with, panti, with every anemo is wind of teaching. So tossed and carried about with every wind of teaching. And again, teaching is the translation of didaskalias down here. And then we have in, probably an N of agency, how the teaching is being done. And we could debate whether it arises out of this, if it's done through this. It's probably a little bit of both. Kubeia is the word for cunning, and then we're going to get over here to panorgia, which is the word for craftiness. Synonymous are these two terms here. And a bit tricky to get this expression just right. But we'll give it our best shot here. About with every wind of teaching by the cunning of men. By, again, and using the same, being used the same way here. By craftiness, by the cunning of men, by craftiness, and then pros. Again, prepositions are the most semantically elastic words that we see in the Greek New Testament, but it has a relationship here then with the methodein is the schemes, and the planes, the deceitful schemes or scheming. By the cunning of men, by craftiness, we might just translate pros as with, by craftiness, with, and try to determine exactly what's the relationship between the craftiness and the deceitful scheming. But we'll just use with for now. By the cunning of men, by craftiness, with, let's translate the deceitful schemes. And then verse 15. One of my favorite participles in the Greek New Testament is this one. It's the verbal form of truth. So we'd translate that literally truthing it in love. The English version says speaking the truth. The Spanish Bible says following the truth in love, because neither one has a verb for truthing it in love. Literally, it's just truthing in love. And so he does, throughout the book, he talks about speaking. He does talk about behavior, hence the divide, whether it should be speaking or following the truth in love. We might just put it here, truthing it. Why not? Truthing it, literally translated, truthing it in love. And then de, he's contrasting the false teaching that tosses and carries people about, disorients them, with what Christian responsibility is, but we are truthing it in love by doing this, really, but by truthing it in love, auxesomen, and that explains, the causative here is explained by the subjunctive which follows, we might grow in him. Now, tapanta has an interesting use here. It's literally, most of the time is translated as all things, but here it seems to be being used more as an adverb, that we might grow up into him in every way, and every possible thing that's necessary for our sanctification and growth. As we are truthing it in love, Christ will oversee that happens. We might grow up in him, all things in every way is probably a good translation. But truthing it in love, we might grow up in him in every way. Hos estin, who is the head, Christ. We might grow up in him. We might grow up, and let's rearrange this just a little bit so it's more clear in English. We might grow up in every way in him. And now we can have in English the relative pronoun close to its referent in English, grow up every way in him who is the head, Christ. All right, now let's move down here. Exu, from whom, pantosoma, all the body, and this is the word that means being joined together. This is the word that means being united together. You might notice that he has the soon going here. Comes up a lot in Philippians and in Ephesians. This is something that happens as we work together in the unity of the faith, from whom the whole body, being joined and united together. Again, we have another tricky expression here, through every joint, and then this part's modifying joint. It's in the genitive and it follows it. The joint which supplies or supply. So we might say together through the supply of each joint, or through what each joint supplies even. That might be a little better, through what each joint supplies, kat, according to the working, and metro, in the measure, enose kostu is each part of each part, through what each joint supplies, according to the working and the measure of each part. Now it gets a little complicated because the human body is a little complicated and how it works together, but the way it looks and its functioning together is beautiful. But the grammar and the vocabulary does reflect somewhat the difficulty of describing these interactions in the body. And you might think of a bit of a smoother way to reflect the Greek here, of each part, and then the growth of the body makes unto the edification of itself in love. So let's go ahead and type that out. Of each part makes, you might say for, or produces even the growth, but we'll say for now makes for the growth of the body unto the edification of itself in love.